In Joshua 10, we see what's happened, right? There's been a wholesale destruction, hasn't there? Joshua and the children of Israel, the mighty men of war, have come through, and they have utterly decimated several of the kingdoms in the south. They are marching up. They've conquered, of course, they've crossed over the Jordan, they've conquered Jericho, then they go up to the city of Ai, and they've conquered it, they've killed the king, and then he goes through and in verse 40, well, actually you can go all the way back up to, hold on just a moment. Verse 24, remember Joshua has imprisoned these kings of these various kingdoms, and he brings them out. He tells the men of Israel to put their feet on the necks of these kings to show what God has foreordained. He has promised to give this land into the hands of the Israelites, and this is sort of a symbolic thing. He's showing this is what's going to happen. But remember, they have to remember that anything that they're doing, the way that they're winning these battles is not because of their own efforts, is it? I mean, they have to do something, but the victory has already been promised to them. They merely have to do as God instructs them in order to achieve this victory. And if they do exactly what God tells them to do, what's going to happen? Are they going to continue to achieve these military victories? Is it because of anything that they've done? No, not in the sense that they've planned this and they're responsible for it. God is responsible for it. But He makes them do certain things. Okay, He makes them, you think about the preparations they had to make in order to take Jericho. How not really complicated, but how methodical it was. And if they had changed that in any way, would God have given them the victory? Well, no, because we see how He allowed them to be defeated when Achan had taken that what we would consider a little small piece of that treasure and hid it under his tent. So God would allow them to see defeat. That would happen, and lives would be lost. But as long as they were faithful in their obedience, then the victory is theirs. Well, I mean, what lesson can we learn from that today? It tells us something, right? What does it tell us? Yeah, the victory is ours. However, it requires something on our behalf. What does it require on our behalf? Obedience. Is it partial obedience? Is it obedience to part of it? Is it obedience to the part that we find acceptable and amenable, that we're amenable to? Or is it all obedience? I mean, you think about, these people were asked to come in, and I can imagine being Achan. I know I'm going back a little bit further. I can imagine being Achan. And you know, having been, coming into this promised land and seeing all of this and saying to yourself, man, you know, why can't I, it's right here. Nobody will know. It's not hurting anyone. No one's going to be put out by me taking this. Why can't I just have this little thing? So you take it and you kind of keep it for yourself. Problem is that, what was the commandment? None of that's yours. Yeah, none of that's yours. Everything that's in that city, all of the precious metals, all of that stuff belonged to God. It was to be put in God's treasury. But here he goes. He takes it and he steals it. Essentially, who is he stealing from? God gonna look kindly on being stolen from? No. All right, so the idea of obedience. But the promise was this: if you are obedient, what's going to happen? You're going to win. Yeah, you're going to be blessed. I'm going to give this land to you, but you have to be obedient to me. All right, so that's kind of a constant standard all the way through the book of Joshua. Obedience to God brought reward to the people, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, I'm obedient. I want to go to heaven. That's my reward. If I don't get anything else, I'm fine with that. You know, that's greater than anything I would have here. And I know that in order for me to receive that promise, in order for me to receive that reward, I have to be obedient. And I can't sit and rail against God because He asks me to do something with the promise of some great reward. You know, you see that all the time. People want to complain about, you know, the end result is going to be this great thing, but then you want to complain about how you're going to get there. Think about Naaman. What was the reward Naaman was going to have? Healed of what? Leprosy. Okay. Now, whether this is the same leprosy that we're thinking of today, you know, the idea of Hansen's disease and the kind that eventually takes your life because it basically melts you away, I don't know. But anyway, it was a skin disease that was a problem. So here he had this great reward, but what did he do about the method by which he would receive it? He complained. You know, there are rivers in my own country that are better than this. Why I got to go? Why do I got to go dip in this Jordan River, this muddy, nasty Jordan River? There are beautiful rivers in my own home country. So what did he do? He complained about it. Well, was Naaman ever going to be healed had he not gone and dipped in the Jordan River 7 times? No, those were the conditions. Those are the terms. We either accept them or we reject them, one of the two. And guess what? There are people all over the world today that are rejecting God's terms for salvation. There are people who are rejecting the worship. They're rejecting everything that He requires of us in order to receive a reward.
But that's it. Why do I have to do that? Can I, do it my way? I mean, different water. Water is not going to do anything.
I know. I've run into. It's probably one of the biggest concerns people have. But let's look at it this way. What about worship? I don't need to go to some building to worship God. I can worship God just as easily on a boat on a lake, or in a tree stand hunting deer, or in a golf course.
I'm all right.
I don't. Some people say I don't need religion. Yeah. I want Christ. I just don't want religion. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that goes into the idea of Naaman. I mean, what was so difficult about him going down into that Jordan River 7 times? And even his servant even said, if a man had come out and told you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? I mean, he said, I want you to go and slay 100 of your enemies and bring their heads and put them at my feet. Would he have done it? Oh, yeah. That would have been, absolutely. That sounds more reasonable because he was a man of war. I'm a great man of war. That sounds perfectly reasonable. What he asked him to do was to humble himself and in humility go down and dip in the river 7 times and he would be healed. But he complained about it. That's just unacceptable. What about work? Dean, you will say something. I didn't hear what you said. Okay. Exactly. Why do we have to take the Lord's Supper every single Sunday? Why do we have to do that every first day of the week? Why can't we do that once a month, or when the Spirit hits us, we'll just get here and decide, you know what? Let's have a communion service. I know people who do that, and it's so simple. But obedience is a very complicated thing for a lot of people. Obedience to certain things is acceptable. Obedience to other things, I don't think that God really binds that. I don't think that God really means that. But we see what He means by obedience. If we change, if we alter what He has put into place, the reward's not ours. Okay? He doesn't accept disobedience. Another thing is the idea of covetousness. You think about, and we're going to get into chapter 11, I promise. The idea of, I was looking at this, and it really kind of brought into kind of a sharp focus. You think about Achan's covetousness, and that's why he took it, right? He coveted it. He saw it, saw that it was good, saw it was something to be had. It was something to make one. It was valuable, something to be had to enlarge himself, to have a greater sense of possessions. Certainly so. So it was covetousness that made him take that wedge of gold and the garments and all of the things that he had stolen from God. Okay, but the interesting thing about this is this: that covetousness cost him what? His life. Not only his life, but the lives of his family. And the lives of everything that he had. It was all destroyed. You think about this just for 1 second. If you go just a little bit further, in one short chapter, not a timeline, but in one short chapter, God's going to allow them to sack a city, and they're going to be allowed to plunder it. They're going to be allowed to pillage it, loot it, so to speak. So really, was that covetousness that was kind of short-sighted on Achan's part, wasn't it? I need this, and I need this now. God said He's going to enlarge you. Give Him to, do what God says in His time and at His pleasure. He's going to enlarge you. So that covetousness on the part of Achan was every Sunday was pretty short-sighted, wasn't it? Man, if he had just waited just a short period of time, he would have been able to go in, and that would have been his to take. What he saw, what was good to his eyes, he would have been allowed to take. The idea of covetousness rears itself again. Because what happens in 1 Samuel, the people did what? They coveted the kings of the nations around them, didn't they? We want a king like those guys. We want a king like that guy. I'm not sure why, because if you look at what happened to the kings on their march through Canaan, the kings never came to a good end. Yet they wanted a king like the nations that surrounded them. Talking about very short-sighted. You know, the way that they came in, they didn't have a king. They had a leader, they had judges, they had men who had authority, but they didn't have a king. And in that guise, the nation of the children of Israel swept through the land of Canaan and utterly defeated it and subjugated it with God's help. But in a very short period of time, they decided they didn't like that program anymore. They wanted something like the nations that surrounded them, the nations that they came through and utterly subjected and annihilated. You know, just goes to show the fickle nature of mankind, isn't it? Even ones who have direct authorization from God, who have direct, God is speaking directly to them, yet they still would not listen. They wanted something else. They coveted what they saw. They saw something in those kings, and that's what they wanted more than anything else. Mm-hmm. Yep. But once again, that idea of the way that mankind works, the way that even the children of Israel work. I mean, it's like that with everybody, isn't it? It just goes to show that the people of God are I wouldn't necessarily say more inclined. When we incline our ear towards God, we don't incline it towards something else. But it also shows that we are just as likely to be tempted and pulled away from God as the world is tempted to stay away from God. Okay. All right. So let's go to this, chapter 11, starting in verse 1. And this goes in, once again, we see a confederation of forces that are going to be arrayed against the children of Israel, right, the Israelites. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard this, he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Achshaph, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country, and in Arabah, south of Chinneroth, in the lowland, and Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites in the hill country, the Hivites, under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. Okay, now all that to say this. This was a large confederation of forces. This was no small group of people. They sent as far as they possibly could to this king who we find in verse 10. This was the city that he was in charge of. Hazor was one of the largest cities in the area. Okay, it had a sense of prominence about it that gave this man an air of superior. You know, he had a superior authority. So he sends and he's asking for what? He says, I want you to do something. He says, and they came out in verse 4, and they came out with all their troops, a great horde in number like the sand that is on the seashore. Now that sounds very familiar, right? Because God said he's going to do to the Israelites that. Remember what he said? He said, I'm going to make your descendants like sand on the seashore. They cannot be numbered. Now, this is hyperbole, obviously. We're not talking about the actual number of sands on the seashore, but he's talking about when you see this force arrayed, it's going to be like nothing you've ever seen before. The children of Israel are going to multiply. They're going to thrive, so to speak. Okay, but here he's using it in kind of a negative fashion because this is a force that's going to be arrayed against the Israelites that they're not accustomed to. This is the biggest one they've encountered thus far. It may possibly be even greater than the Egyptians who pursued them after they fled out of Egypt. All right, so it's a large group. Not only are they great in number, but look at what he says right after that, with very many horses and chariots. Now, so far, after they've come into the land of Canaan, they haven't seen chariots. This is something that's new for them. Everyone else they've seen on foot. So here they are, an inferior force number-wise, and they're going up against this vast army with horses and chariots. And in the area in which they're going to be fighting, horses and chariots are pretty helpful. Okay, this is a pretty helpful thing. Now, this is kind of a big thing. I want you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 1. Somebody turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 1. I want you to read that because this gives us an indication about God's already said something about this. Whoever's got there, go ahead and get Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 1. Okay. So God's already told them. He said, this is going to happen. You're going to see things that you haven't seen before. All right, and he tells them, when you go up against these kings and when you go up against these people who have horses and chariots, what? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I can imagine when they you think about the you think about the intimidating factor of leaving Egypt. Here are these people, and God's just delivered them. They have not really come into their own. Moses is not a military leader. These men are not trained to fight in any way, shape, or form. And they come up out of Egypt and they see the Egyptians pursue them, and it said they basically had their backs against the wall. God had to provide a way of escape, which tells us a lot. And there's so many different lessons in there. It's not even funny. But they have their backs against the wall. God provided them a way of escape, didn't He? He provided them a way of escape because He parted the waters. They marched across, and then God did what to the Egyptians? He closed the waters and He destroyed them. Okay, He utterly destroyed them. As a matter of fact, he said something along the lines, "You will not see these men again ever. You will not see these men again forever." I think I'm trying to remember exactly how it's phrased. You will never see these people again forever. And that was one of the things. You're never going to go back to Egypt. You're never going to go back into captivity in Egypt. And again, those who pursue you will be destroyed. Those who seek to come against you as my people will be destroyed. So they've seen a lot. They've seen a great deal of things that they haven't seen before in the way that they're coming through. They're coming out of Egypt and they're going into Canaan. They saw the Egyptians come after them. They saw God destroy them through the waters. Then they go into Canaan and they see the walled city of Jericho, and they do what they do, and they march around it, and the walls fall down. Okay. Then they go and they conquer. They're conquering these cities as they go, and they're taking no prisoners. They're annihilating the peoples that they come in contact with. God's using them as a push broom, and He's basically sweeping Canaan clean. All right. So now they're going to be faced with something that they haven't seen yet again. That's the idea of horses and mounted chariots. All right. So He goes through and He gives them this instruction. He says, when you're faced with these, don't be afraid, because who's in control? God's in control. I'm in control. Don't worry about it. Do not be afraid. And look at it. It will continue on. And all these kings joined their forces and came together and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So we see that they've come together with an express purpose of doing what? To defeat the Israelites. The name of the Israelites has spread, and what they've done up to this point has come up before all of these people. These kingdoms, these kings in the north are getting word that these Israelites, not only are they coming through, they're an inferior force numbers-wise, but they're still winning. And when they're winning, they're not just enslaving the people that they're coming in contact with. They're destroying them. They're destroying their cities. They're looting. They're taking everything that belongs to them. So these kings, and understandable. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Hey, if we don't band together, we can't fight them individually. So their idea is, of course, numbers. If we have enough numbers, we can defeat these people. So they all come together with the express purpose of defeating and destroying the Israelites. But in verse 6 we read, the Lord again says to Joshua what He said in the past. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them." It's interesting that He still has to keep telling him this, because that's understandable, right? Here you are, this inferior force. You see the numbers, and you see the horses, and you see the chariots, and it reminds you maybe of being pursued. Not none of these people, but I'm saying that would remind you of being pursued, wouldn't it? Yeah. None of these people were of course, there at the time. But they're seeing this for the first time. They're seeing these horses and their chariots. They're frightened. But God still has to keep telling them, do not be afraid. I know what it looks like. I know it looks like there's no way that you could possibly defeat these enemies. No way. And does God still have to keep telling us, don't be afraid? Because we're still afraid, right? Is there anything wrong with being afraid? The only problem with being afraid is when we allow it to color our actions. Okay? There's such a thing as a reasonable fear. Okay? But it's when fear dictates what we do. And when we act in a fearful manner. Okay, that's dangerous, right? That's a dangerous thing to do. We have to act as if we have the confidence that we should be having. Okay? When God says that don't be afraid, He means that literally. Don't be afraid of these people. Okay? It looks like a superior force. It looks like they can do great damage. But what does He say to them? For tomorrow, what? Tomorrow, no, look what He says. Tomorrow at this time, what does He say? I will, okay. Okay, all right, stop right there. Look how He phrases that. He says, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time, what? I will do what? I will deliver them. I will deliver them. So basically, God has said, I'm going to fight this battle for you. I will deliver them. Now, you're going to have a part to play. You're going to have to go out. You're going to have to fight. But I'm going to be the one that delivers the victory. Okay? You just merely do as I tell you to do, and I'll ensure that whatever is supposed to happen is going to happen. Do not be afraid, for tomorrow at this time, so less than 24 hours from now, I will deliver all of these, what? Slain, dead to you. Okay? You won't have to mop up. I will deliver all of these slain to you. Now look at what He says again right after this. He says, you shall do what? Hamstring their horses and do what? Burn their chariots with fire. This is a very telling thing. God does not want them to put their trust into these articles of warfare. He said, I don't want you to have chariots. Okay? I don't want you to build or inherit these things from this confederation. After they die, I want you to hamstring their horses, and I want you to burn their chariots. Don't put your trust in the articles of warfare that they use. Why? Because I'm the trump card, right? I'm the thing that they are not expecting. They're going to come against you with horses and chariots. And in their minds, they have a superior force, they have superior training, and truthfully, they probably do. But at the end of the day, no matter what they have, no matter what great military strategy they might have, no matter what great armaments they might have, no matter what it is, at the end of the day, I trump all of it. Me. I do. You don't worry about it. I'm going to deliver them to you dead. And then I want you to hamstring the horses, and I want you to burn the chariots. Basically what? They're going to do what? They're going to do what to this fighting force, this great confederacy? It's going to be utterly destroyed. There's not going to be anything left of it. All the fighting men are going to be dead. The horses are going to be hamstrung. The chariots are gone. It's going to be like that fighting force never came up. And that's what it's kind of representative of what they're doing throughout the whole land of Canaan, isn't it? It's going to be like these people never existed. They're going to be gone. That's exactly what He said. And He's using the children of Israel for this purpose. I mean, they came to this place because God promised them a homeland. He promised them a nation. All right, and He promised them a people. And that's what He's giving to them. And He's also using them as an instrument, an arm of justice. He's going to destroy the people, the inhabitants of Canaan, because of their wickedness. So it's a twofold thing. The children of Israel get what they were promised, and the people who lived in Canaan are suffering the wrath of God that they had turned their back on several hundred years before that. Oh. But if you think about this, and it tells us something even today, what does it mean when we get something for nothing? We don't appreciate it, okay? Have you ever given a child something that they didn't have to work for? And they really probably didn't treat it very well, did they? Well, there's adults like that. You give people something, and they haven't had to work for it. They haven't had to expend any effort for it, and it does not mean anything to them. It doesn't mean anything to them. the children of Israel had to go through this. I call it, it's not a physical baptism, but this baptism of going through the work to do what was necessary. But listen, is it easier to go through the work when you know that someone has got your back? When you know that someone is going to work for you and fight on your behalf? Yeah, it makes it a whole lot easier. Especially when you're assured of an outcome. You just do what I tell you to do, you're going to win. And then that promise is kept all the way through. As God does as His promises, He always fulfills His promise. Okay. Yeah, it was a large victory at once, which is always a good thing. You can defeat everybody at once. So here's what happens. Okay, so what do they do? Does Israel believe him? Well, it tells us. So Joshua in verse 7. So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Merom, where they were camping, and did what? Attacked them, fell upon them, depending on your translation. Same thing. They fell upon them, they attacked them. And the Lord did what? In verse 8, the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who did what? Okay, so there was work being done, right? The Israelites were doing something to accomplish the will of God. The will of God was that this confederation be destroyed. God was going to make it happen. So He says, even though they personally were attacking, the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. So guess what? Both entities were doing their part. The Israelites were doing as they were told to do. God did as He said He was going to do. He gave them into His hand. All right. Now, the idea of God gave them into His hand, there was a great deal of speculation about exactly how this happened. Did the Lord give the Israelites even more strength? Did He cause their enemies to their hearts to fail them and to lose the will to fight? I think it's probably a little bit of both. It's easy to say, well, He gave them into their hand, but how? Truthfully, don't know. Don't know. The way that God works is the way that God works. He doesn't tell us. He just merely says that He gave them into His hand. So it has to tell. I certainly understand this, that God had a hand in it. God was working actively in this great battle that Joshua and his men of valor were fighting against this confederation. I'm not exactly sure how it was that God gave them into His hand, because we see where the Israelites had to fight. They had to attack. They had to do the work. So how He did it, I don't know. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. What we're told is what we're told, and what we're told, we can absolutely be assured happened. Both of them did something. The Israelites fought. God gave them into their hands. We can understand that perfectly. The Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as Great Sidon and Misrephoth Maim, and eastward as far as the valley of Mizpah. And He struck them until He left none remaining. Well, we also know that in the previous chapter we saw where God, as the men were fleeing from the face of Israel, the men of Israel, He caused great hailstones to fall on them, and He kept throwing these rocks at them. That's just out of all the things that we've seen on the screen in regards to the Bible, most of them have just been terrible. But this is one that I would really like to see happen. I would love to see an account of Joshua, just to see some of the things that God did and see them well done. You can imagine what these men, they're thinking, we're far enough ahead of them, we can get away. And then, out of nowhere, from the sky, giant hailstones start falling. These people, they're running and going, you got to be kidding me, And smack. And they're these big hailstones are killing large numbers of men at a time. So it says, even if you can get far enough ahead of them, and you can run as fast as you can't outrun God. Okay. All right. So they struck them until He left none remaining. So they utterly defeated this massive force. It's funny. They don't. Out of all the accounts, this is the one that has the largest number of people that were fighting. This is the shortest one. This is the shortest one. All the rest of them have this story to be told. God says, I don't care how big the enemy, this army is, this enemy is, I'm going to defeat them for you. And He does it. And it's basically that short and that simple. So when He said, and Joshua did to them just as the Lord said to him. He hamstrung their horses and he burned their chariots with fire. You know what? No, it'd be very difficult. Now, I was curious about this. I was really curious about this, and I read, and this is pure speculation, that when it says that they hamstrung them, it basically means that they hobbled them so that they couldn't be used for warfare anymore. They were still usable as farm animals or beasts of burden. That is speculation. There's nothing in Scripture that tells us that. But it is interesting they didn't say he slew them with a sword or killed them or did whatever. So it's interesting they said that he hamstrung them rather than kill them. I would imagine that that God might be just being a little bit logical and saying, hey, you can still use these, but they can't be used for warfare anymore, so they hobbled them. Don't know. Yeah. Oh yeah. Everything. Put everything to the sword. That's just it. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what that idea of hamstrung. Did they actually sever the tendon and allow them to not move at all, or did they basically hobble them so they couldn't be used for that, but they could walk and carry things? I don't know. But anyway, the whole point was that they would not be able to certainly wouldn't be able to be used by the enemy anymore, and they were useless whichever way they did that. They would be useless to be used against Israel. Okay, so at the end of the day, is Israel's enemy defeated? Wholly defeated. There's nothing more that can be done with them. There's nothing that can be done for them. Okay. All right. So verse 10, and Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor formerly was the head of all those kingdoms. So here we get back into the idea about this king at the first part of the chapter, that he called this confederation together, and it says that Hazor formerly was the head of all of those kingdoms. So it had a place of prominence in the area, and whether the other kingdoms were, as we call them, vassal states, or whether they were allies of the king, they heeded the call. They listened, and when he said, hey, get an army together, come and join with me because we're going to do this, they could have been doing it because they were obligated to, because they were subjugated to the king of Hazor, or they were allies, and being shrewd, being logical, said, well, I'd rather go up against them with a large force than a small force. That makes sense. Okay? All right. And they struck with the sword all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. There was none left that breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all of their kings Joshua captured and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. So it's interesting. He's even going back here to the instructions of Moses, because Moses told him, when you go into this land, don't leave them alive. God wants you to destroy these inhabitants of Canaan. If they flee before you, let them go. But if they remain and they fight against you, you are to destroy them. And that's where they made their big mistake with the Jebusites. Remember, they didn't listen to God. They didn't take counsel from God, and they allowed the Jebusites to remain because they had been tricked. And they had been tricked because they didn't ask God. But none of the cities that stood on mounds did Israel burn, except Hazor alone that Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock the people of Israel took for their plunder. But every person they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua. And so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all the Lord had commanded Moses. And here, don't really even need to go into the rest of this, but you see in the remainder of this chapter where God begins to divvy up the land. That was the whole point of it, right? Every one of those tribes was going to come in. They were going to get an inheritance. And here it shows where God took a portion of it, gave instruction. This part is to go to this group. This part is to go to this group. And you kill everyone in it, and you take the land and you divide it up. And the inheritance, that's what they've been waiting for, right? So he told them he was going to give them. Going to give them a land. He's going to give them a place that was going to be theirs forevermore. And that land would pass generation after generation after generation after generation. And had they been faithful, it would have continued. But they were not faithful. It was taken away from them. All right. Yeah. Well, absolutely. If you read the law, if you read the instructions, God said that you're not to marry with any of these people. You're not to intermarry with any of these people. Okay? Do not take for yourselves. Do not take wives for your sons or husbands for your daughters from the nations that surround you. Okay? Certainly his desire was for his people to remain pure. And if you look at it and the lengths that God went to achieve that for the nation of Israel, we think about that. Why do we take it so lightly in the church? Why do we take it so lightly in the church? Why do some believe that we can fellowship with outside of the church in the sense that we fellowship with each other? And that's acceptable to God. God wants the church to be pure. We cannot what business does light have with darkness? Okay? It doesn't. Yes, we do. We have friends with those we feel. That's who we associate with is very important, and who the church fellowships with is very important. The church fellowships with the church. We don't fellowship with the world. Can we be friendly with those in the world? Absolutely, certainly so. It'd be very difficult to evangelize people that we're not friendly with, but it does not mean that we fellowship with. Yes. Yes, we do. Yeah. Absolutely. We start using words and phrases and doctrinal ideas that are not found in Scripture. And a lot of people I've done a lot of study in the idea about the concept of utter destruction and the idea of everyone. There are those who want to downplay that. They want to water that down and say, well, really, the Lord only, when it says all that breathe, it's only this group of people. But that's not what Scripture says. Scripture says all who breathe. That means man, woman, and child. We think, how could God destroy? How could God not only allow but command the death of men and women and small children? It's because God means what He means. He's serious about it. He's serious about it. Yeah. Let me tell you. Let's bring this and let's flip it a little bit. When Moses, right around the time Moses was born, what was the commandment that the Egyptians, the Pharaoh had set out? What was it? What were they to do? What were the Egyptian women, the Egyptian midwives to do? Kill. Okay, kill all the baby boys. Don't you know that later on they had wished that they had killed every single one of the baby boys? Because what did Moses come back and do? What did Moses come back and do? He brought Jehovah God to the doorstep of the Egyptians and said, don't you know they wish they had killed him instead of letting him grow up in Pharaoh's household? Okay, now let's think about that. Let's turn it back around. Think about the children of Israel. When God said, destroy every man, woman, and child, there's a reason that He said, I want you to destroy. I want you to put every single person to the sword, man, woman, and child. And we think, that's not a loving God. Well, He is loving. He is loving. Absolutely, He is loving. But He was showing His love to the Israelites. He gave them a commandment to do something, and He had His reasons for doing it. See, short-sighted, we would say, well, that's just wrong. What possibly could a child do? Why would you kill a child? Well, God knows far more than we do. He sees forward and backwards and sideways. He knows exactly what's going to happen. Okay? That child does not stay a child. He does not stay a child. And he wanted his people to be pure, and they could not be pure if they had the inhabitants growing up and continuing to, reproduce, procreate, so to speak. See, to us it sounds harsh. We think, how horrible is that? But at the end of the day, if we're going to trust God's wisdom, we have to trust it even in ways that we look at it and say that just doesn't make sense. We have to trust His wisdom, and He has wisdom. Tells them that this is what has to happen. All right, we're going to run into services. All right, let's finish there. We're gonna pick back up next week. So come back. We'll talk a little bit about the last part of chapter 11, and then we're going to get into chapter 12 next week. Of course.